Hello, everybody, and welcome to our discussion today focused on accountability for climate change harms in the Pacific Northwest. I'm Melissa Powers, Jeffrey Bain Faculty Scholar and Professor of Law at Lewis and Clark Law School, and the Faculty Director of the Green Energy Institute at Lewis and Clark. I'm going to be the MC for this event, as well as the moderator of our panel discussion. Today, we are going to be exploring how and why fossil fuel companies could be held responsible for the costs of responding to climate change. As climate science has evolved, it has become easier to show that a relatively small number of actors, known often as carbon majors, are responsible for the vast majority of historical and current greenhouse gas emissions. These carbon majors profited from selling fossil fuels, while they pass the costs of climate change onto society as a whole. Society now must take a wide range of actions to adapt to warming temperatures, rising seas, increased drought, more frequent wildfires and storms, and a host of other consequences of climate change. The major question then is who should pay for these adaptation responses? We'll be exploring that overarching question today. We are going to be treated to some introductory remarks by Washington Attorney General Ferguson and Oregon Attorney General Rosenblum, followed by brief presentations from our panelists, and then some questions and answers for our panelists. If you would like to pose any questions, please type them into the Q&A. We'll try to get to as many as possible, but we likely will not be able to address all of them in the short time that we have. Before we begin, I wanted to thank those who have helped make this event possible, especially Alyssa Joel and Corey Witte Wright of the Center for Climate Integrity, Kara Saylor of the Green Energy Institute, Nick Caleb of the Breach Collective. And I also want to thank Henry Van Buren for providing us with IT support today. So we are delighted to begin with some introductory remarks from the Attorney Generals from both Washington and Oregon. Washington Attorney General Bob Ferguson is Washington State's 18th Attorney General. As the state's chief legal officer, Bob is committed to protecting the people of Washington against powerful interests that don't play by the rules. He is a fourth generation Washingtonian, a graduate of the University of Washington and New York University Law School. Bob and his wife, Colleen, are the proud parents of 13-year-old twins, Jake and Katie. AG Ferguson has signed on to multiple amicus briefs in support of climate damages and fraud lawsuits brought by other states and municipalities against major oil and gas companies. Oregon Attorney General Ellen Rosenblum was recently reelected to her third term as Oregon's first woman AG. She is a former judge and federal prosecutor and has a strong record supporting environmental justice. The Oregon Department of Justice Natural Resources section, which she oversees, represents state agencies in all matters pertaining to Oregon's air, land, and waters. Her environmental crimes prosecutor cracks down on illegal polluters. During the past 4 years, in addition to the 50 lawsuits she has filed against the prior federal administration, the Attorney General joined over 200 actions to fight back against anti-environmental rule changes by federal agencies. AG Rosenblum has also joined amicus briefs in support of the recent wave of climate damages lawsuits. AG Ferguson, thank you for being here, and I'll hand the reins over to you.
Thanks so much, Professor, and thanks so much for, oops, let me make sure I've got myself on here. There we go. Am I back on now? Perfect. Hey, great to see you. Thanks, Professor, for that introduction. Thanks to all the sponsors and really to each of you individually for what you do to work on this really important issue, which of course has such impacts for our entire region. I mean, it's clear that the threats of climate change to our region are existential. They're existential for us as human beings. They're existential for us as a region. They're existential for our salmon. You mentioned, Professor, wildfires, for example, a huge topic of conversation in our state legislature right now as we speak about how we can do a better job to address that. But my God, the cost and the human toll and the financial cost is profound. And that's just one example. So I thought in the very few minutes I have, and by the way, any excuse that gets me to see my colleague Ellen from Oregon is always something I look forward to. But before you hear from Ellen and the panel, one thing I took a look at was, the mission statement for the Center for Climate Integrity talks about empowering communities, and elected officials to hold polluters accountable for their contribution to the climate crisis. And that, combined with part of the focus today, is a focus on climate litigation. I thought I'd take a few minutes I have to maybe ground my thoughts in on those two issues. And in terms of empowering elected officials, when I started as Attorney General 8 years ago, we had nobody in our office. We're the largest law firm in the state of Washington. We have more than 600 attorneys, more than 600 professional staff. We're a huge operation. We did not have anyone in our office who prosecuted environmental crimes, period. We had no division, no unit that handled civil environmental litigation on behalf of the people. Didn't exist. I remember reading an article about Ellen's predecessor, actually, how the Oregon AG's office actually prosecuted, I think you mentioned this in your introduction, Professor, environmental crimes. And I went to my team, I said, well, why don't we do that? Well, we don't have the money, the legislature had to get the dough. I'll spare you the story, but I just said to the team, look, we need to be doing that for all the reasons you're having this conversation, right? The impacts on climate to our region are profound. We need to hold powerful interests accountable who are harming our environment here in the Northwest. And so we got creative and we did that. And it's had a tremendous impact on our ability for accountability. And I think even the way you frame this conference is around accountability. Look, there is no accountability if you do not have the resources to enforce our laws. Have all the laws in the books you want. I'm all in favor of them, don't get me wrong, right? I support those. But unless you got folks who are willing to get creative and actually enforce those damn laws, what good are they? And so now I'm proud we actually have a division in our office that enforces our environmental laws. And what we do is without taxpayer money, to be honest with you. We recently resolved a case against a large corporation for $100 million, environmental case. We sent tens of millions to the state of Washington to help on the environment, but we kept millions back to grow that team to do more cases. I'll give you another example. You mentioned the Trump administration. Washington was a part of 97 lawsuits against the administration. That's a lot of litigation. One thing I emphasize is more than half of those cases, I bet this is true for Ellen as well, more than half of those cases were related to one general topic, and that's the environment. In some form or another, they're environmental cases, about 50 of them, which is kind of insane when you think about it, right? Well, look, if you told me 8 years ago that I'd be a part of 50 environmental lawsuits against a president, his administration, I would have said, you're crazy. We don't have the resources. We can't possibly do that. Well, we figured it out. And so one thing I just would encourage folks to think about, and when talking to elected officials, is a lot of elected officials say, well, I can't do that. We've never done it that way before. I'm not sure it's the right question. The question is, can you do it? Can you figure out a way to make that happen? And every elected official has a different role. A county executive, a city council member, a state legislator, a governor, or as Ellen and I know, an attorney general. I think once we start asking the right question in our office about how to go about doing it, hey, life changed in our office. And just in the last minute I have, I will say that, on that federal litigation, for example, some of those cases that we're working with Ellen and other states on have huge consequences. We're leading a lawsuit in Washington, a multi-state lawsuit, to stop the oil drilling plan at the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And we've been successful so far in that case. We put a stop to restarting a coal leasing program that the Trump administration put in place. We won that case in Montana before a federal judge in Montana. Fuel efficiency standards, Ellen and I are working on that, where the Trump administration's rolling back fuel efficiency standards. All of these things and many, many other cases have profound impacts on our climate. So I think maybe it's a thought I'll just leave you with before turning this over to Ellen, is that, as Attorney General, I think a lot about accountability. That's what I think about every day, honestly, and I appreciate the focus that you have on that piece of it, because let's be honest, the entities that we're up against who are contributing to the climate crisis, they're powerful. Like, they're really, really powerful. They have all the resources money can buy. And look, I used to be in private practice as a lawyer. I have some sense of the scale of what the resources are that corporations have when they're being sued or they're being challenged. And so it takes a team effort on the ground, communities, activists, attorneys general, elected officials, you name it, right? To really come together and use every resource we have and get creative with that if we're going to have that accountability that is so necessary. And look forward to any feedback you have. Feel free to let my office know if we can be helpful. I know we got a lot of folks on here from Washington State and the home of the future national champions, Gonzaga Bulldogs, by the way. Put them on your bracket if there's still time. And so But really just feel free to hear, I really welcome any feedback you have on what more we can do as an office to help on this issue. So hopefully I haven't gone on too long, and really it's my great honor. Ellen, it's great to see you. Ellen's just such a fantastic human being, as well as a great attorney general. All of you in Oregon are really, really lucky to have her. She's just a great person and a great colleague and well respected by all attorneys general across the country. Ellen, it's great to see you. I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Bob. Oh my goodness. Well, it's always great to be with my colleague to the north, Bob Ferguson. And it's great to know that there's actually one thing we were ahead of you on, because you are amazing and we're always kind of copycatting you. So kind of fun to learn that. And I'm glad that you've been able to have developed that unit for environmental crimes. It's so important. And my predecessor was very visionary in that regard. So as all as you can probably tell, the collaborations and the partnerships we attorneys general have built are incredibly robust, and they've led to many important outcomes for our environment, for natural resources, and for our climate. So we really love working together. We meet once a week on the phone, the Democratic AGs do, and we've been doing that literally for the last 4 years since the first executive order came out. We'll never forget that one, right, Bob? And Bob was the leader on the that amazing work that you did following that lawsuit with regard to the travel ban. So thank you for forever. You will be in our debt for that. So I am imagining all of your bright faces, even though I can't see you. I know that we have over 100 people already and more to come, I think, during the course of this conversation today. And I'm just so glad that we can be together for this event to better understand the scientific, the policy, and the legal tools that are available to battle the climate crisis. I don't need to tell you the scope of this threat that we face. It's enormous and will require all of us and everyone else on this planet to work in thoughtful, aggressive ways to address it. It is truly, as Bob said, the existential threat of our time. And there, I said it. And Bob described some major multi-state wins we've had. And before I highlight a few more areas that we've worked on, I want to put the work of the Oregon Department of Justice in a little bit of a larger context. First and foremost, as was mentioned in Melissa's introduction, thank you, we provide legal guidance, and Bob does that too, to state agencies. That's the main role. That's what we do as state attorneys general. And we try to do so with an environmental lens. There's also the making of policy. I'm not a lawmaker, but we weigh in with the legislature and state agencies whenever we think it's appropriate on policy issues, and we're doing that right now. We have a bill that's going very well that's going to help us to clean up a very filthy, contaminated part of our river. We also look out for Oregonians when it comes to environmental protection. This often involves challenging large global corporations, and it runs the gamut from going after Volkswagen for falsifying data about its car emissions to suing Monsanto for natural resource damages caused by the long-term environmental impacts of PCBs. Our Special Assistant Attorney General, Dan Menscher, is leading much of this casework for us in tandem with our Special Litigation Unit, and he's on the panel today. So I'm not going to steal his thunder. I'm going to let him talk about the Monsanto lawsuit. And of course, I also have my bully pulpit as Attorney General. And the climate crisis is going to be huge. It has been, but it's going to be even huger on my priorities during my third term, which has just begun. And as Bob suggested, our actions on the federal level likely have the greatest impact. These past 4 years, or just Oregon alone has participated in over 200 of such actions. And I think Bob probably twice that, with the goal of protecting our environment and fighting climate change. And if you want to actually see what all those actions are, go to the NYU State Environmental Impact Center website. And you can just look up the state. You can look up Oregon, look up Washington, look up any state, and you'll see the list of those 210, I think in my case, actions, and all the other states. A great, great resource. Your law school, Bob, right? So here are just two examples in Oregon that we've been working on, kind of been mentioned a little bit already. With respect to vehicles, our multi-state AG coalition fought the rollback of emission standards for motor vehicles. Obama administration rules had required automakers to improve fuel efficiency standards for cars hitting 54 miles per gallon by 2026. After the Trump administration scaled those requirements back dramatically, which they did a lot of during the past 4 years, we sued to stop the repeal. And we were able to delay the new requirements long enough to carry us through the election so that the Biden administration can now address the issue directly. And they are just hitting the ground running, as we've seen. Secondly, methane emissions. Recognizing methane's major role in warming, in 2016, the EPA set methane standards for new sources throughout the oil and gas industry. Remember, that was the year before Trump. But again, the Trump administration stalled on this requirement and then attempted to repeal the new source rule. As with auto emissions, our coalition filed a challenge in court, resulting in a Biden administration stay to address the issue directly. So, we've been fortunate to have ringside seats at all of this. I've been serving as the co-chair of the Democratic Attorneys General Association during this period. And as I mentioned, we have these weekly calls where we get updates and give updates on all these cases. And we sign on to various letters and lawsuits, and we have a very nimble process so that we've been able to get an amazing amount of work done. Now, our state agencies are also working diligently on the climate front, so I can't leave them out. On everything from designing a climate protection program that will limit greenhouse gas emissions from large stationary sources, transportation fuels, and natural gas, to increasing transportation electrification across the state. Let me offer one more example of what's involved in our state agency work. A year ago, Governor Brown issued Executive Order 2004, and it's been dubbed the Climate EO. And it directed 16 state agencies and commissions to pursue every option available under existing law to combat climate change. I'm not going to read it to you, but you can read it. It's pretty impressive. So you understand what a big deal this is. And shortly after the Climate EO was issued, the governor, of course, was sued by fossil fuel distributors and other industry coalitions that rely heavily on such fuels. They claimed the governor had acted beyond her constitutional authority in issuing this executive order. To this point, we have successfully defended the governor's authority in state court. But let me tell you, these big companies, and you all know this, especially those of you in the organization that's sponsoring this program, these big companies come to these matters equipped with the best lawyers money can buy. And it's with real pride that I tell you that our lawyers and Washington lawyers have proved their match time and again. So finally, but just as importantly, let me touch on climate impacts felt here at home, several already been mentioned, to remind us all of the serious consequences of inaction, or even less than sweeping action on climate change now. Oregon is already experiencing adverse, and to be frank, truly frightening impacts. The effects are felt in our natural environment, in our public health, and in our economy. You're no doubt well aware of the utter devastation of the wildfires caused across our state in September of last year. The unusually high winds and continued dry weather of September 2020 caused a rapid and uncontrollable expansion of multiple wildfires, burning over 1 million acres and driving thousands from their homes in search of safety. So even those who were not in evacuation zones, we were driven into our homes, right? For well over a week because the outside air was too hazardous to breathe. According to global air quality rankings, we experienced some of the unhealthiest air on the planet during that period, with air quality so hazardous in some parts of Oregon that it actually exceeded the limits of our state's air quality index. So it was disastrous. But most striking was the number of homes lost. Over 4,000 homes burned down to the ground, and even more tragically, Oregonians' lives were lost. So in addition to growing wildfire threats, Oregon is experiencing loss of mountain snowpack and drought. Ocean acidification, I can barely say it, and hypoxia continue to increase with detrimental impacts on our state's marine life, including oysters, our beloved Dungeness crabs, which in turn threaten marine ecosystems, fisheries, and seafood businesses that play a vital role in our economy and our culture. So all of these changes have serious public health consequences and environmental justice consequences that should motivate us as we work to assemble this patchwork of tools at the federal, state, and local levels to meet this crisis head on. So thank you for inviting me and Bob to speak with you today. I look forward to learning from the panel of experts that have joined us and to finding ways to weave our specific skills sets together in a unified charge against climate harms in 2021 and beyond.
Thank you so much, AG Rosenblum, and thank you so much, AG Ferguson, for being here and providing us with these excellent introductory remarks. We are now going to go ahead and move into our panel discussion. This panel is going to explore the science, law, and policy of climate change accountability. Specifically, it's going to consider how climate change has already affected our communities in the Pacific Northwest, teeing off some of what AG Rosenblum just mentioned, but focusing in particular on Multnomah County's effects. And we're going to learn what the science tells us about the links between those impacts, climate change, and the greenhouse gas emitters, as well as the potential legal tools available to ensure that communities have the resources to adapt to those climate changes that are already locked in. We are not going to be focusing today on the legal tools to prevent more emissions and to limit the extent of climate change, which is known as mitigation. Of course, that's very important to pursue mitigation, but it's at least as important to ensure that we can start to address the problems that we're already feeling. This is also important to keep in mind from a legal perspective, because as some of you likely know, there's been a lot of climate litigation underway for the past 2 decades, including common law climate litigation. And there was a so-called first wave of common law litigation that sought either to compel governments to act to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or to compel emissions reductions from private parties, the big emitters. Now, those changes often raise concerns from the courts because they were either concerned about directing agencies to act when courts wanted to see Congress and agencies act on their own initiative, or for directing the behavior of private parties. So while some cases during the first wave of climate change litigation succeeded, a number of other cases didn't because of these judicial concerns about overreach. Those cases, however, are very different than our focus today. Our focus today is on what happens when somebody causes a harm in terms of their legal accountability for helping to fix that harm. Basic principles of fairness would say that those who create problems should bear some accountability for fixing them. And so that's what we're going to be exploring today with this panel. Our 3 panelists today are Dr. Karen Schell, Dan Menscher, and Multnomah County Chair Deborah Caferry. I'm going to go ahead and introduce all 3 of them and then hand it over to Dr. Schell to begin. Dr. Karen Schell is the Associate Professor and Climate Science Program Head of the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences at Oregon State University. Dr. Schell has a Bachelor's of Science in Physics from Harvey Mudd College and a PhD in Climate Sciences from Scripps Institute of Oceanography. Dr. Schell has written extensively on climate modeling and feedbacks, and she was an expert reviewer of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 5th assessment report. Next, we'll hear from Dan Menscher. Dan Menscher is an attorney at Keller Rohrbach, which is a nationally recognized law firm with a nationally recognized complex litigation group, which focuses on environmental cases and representing government entities in important litigation. Dan has litigated important environmental and consumer cases across the country in federal and state court. He presently represents the state of Oregon in its case against Monsanto, seeking to hold the corporate giant responsible for natural resource damages related to its sale and marketing of PCBs. He is also part of the Keller Rohrbach team representing more than 70 counties, cities, and tribes in the fight to hold drug manufacturers and other entities accountable for the opioid crisis. Dan has filed amicus briefs on behalf of interested parties in support of recent climate damage lawsuits. Dan is also an alumnus of Lewis and Clark Law School and one of my former students, so I'm super happy to have him here. And then finally, we have Deborah Caferry, who is the Multnomah County Chair. Chair Caferry has long propelled innovative solutions to the region's most pressing issues of homelessness, economic disparities, and gaps in the behavioral health system. She co-founded the Joint Office for Homeless Services with the City of Portland, as well as a Home for Everyone, the region's first community-wide strategy for preventing and ending homelessness, which served more than 35,000 people last year. Chair Caferry began her public service in the Oregon House of Representatives and served 2 years as the House Minority Leader. In 2008, she was elected to the Multnomah County Commission. She was elected Multnomah County Chair in 2014, and she was reelected in May 2018 for a second term. I'll just also note that Chair Caferry chairs a really impactful sustainability group within Multnomah County that's been doing a great deal of innovative work when it comes to addressing climate change, especially equitably. So we're delighted to have all three of our presenters. And Professor Shell, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Melissa. And it's great to be here. I'm a scientist and I don't know much about law, so I'm really interested in learning a lot today. The title slide I have here shows a picture from those of the smoke from those fires that Attorney General Rosenblum discussed earlier. And in fact, she gave away a lot of my talk, so you'll hear some common themes here. But as you can see, these fires were quite extensive, and there wasn't, in fact, room to show all of the smoke on the side of my slide here. So you're all probably aware about the increase in carbon dioxide that we see. We have records going back to the mid 1950s, a continuous record from this observatory in Hawaii. So why is the CO2 concentration increasing? Well, if you put a line for the extra emission due to fossil fuels, which you can really barely see, there's this really thin red line. You'll note that it lines up very well with the increase in carbon dioxide that we do in fact observe. And so there's a very close link between this increase in carbon dioxide that we're seeing in the record and the emissions from fossil fuel combustion and cement. And so that is a very clear link. Now, if we go from that carbon dioxide record, how do we know that that is related to the temperature change that we've seen? So this is the same plot on the left-hand side. On the lower right is the global average temperature change going back to sort of the beginning of when we had reasonable records and going up to just this past year. And so you'll see, if you look at the same period of time, starting around 1960, and compare that to the CO2 curve, you see that they're both increasing. That doesn't necessarily mean that one causes the other. You might have heard the phrase, correlation does not imply causation. And so we want to show that this global temperature change is related to the increase in CO2 gases and other greenhouse gases and such. And this is an example of attribution. So there's a lot here on this plot. Bear with me for a second and I'll step through it. The very thick orange line on the left-hand side and the thick blue line on the right-hand side are averages from a bunch of computer simulations of the climate. These are calculated using climate models that are sort of similar to the models that we use to predict weather. They've got a slightly different focus, but they're still based on the fundamental physics that we know about the climate system. The shading around both of these, so the orange shading around the left-hand side and the blue shading around the right-hand side, shows the range of model results. So some models show a larger change, some show a smaller change. So this gives you an idea of the uncertainty in these modeled estimates. Now on both the left and right-hand side, there are a bunch of thin lines. So these thin lines that seem to go all up and down together, they are the same on the left-hand and the right-hand side, and they represent the observational record. So one of these lines, the light blue line, is the same record I just showed you. And you can see they're all showing an increase over this time period. There's some differences because there's uncertainty in any observation that you make, but they all are showing this basic increase in temperature over the last 50, 60, 70 years. On the left-hand side, the models include the effects of this increased carbon dioxide. So these models have as part of them that plot of carbon dioxide increase we just saw. On the right-hand side, the models do not have that increase. And so these are just changes due to things like, small solar variability or volcanoes, stuff like that. The thing to note here is that none of the models show this increase that we see in the recent decades without adding the effects of increased greenhouse gases due to anthropogenic, so human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. You can only get that increase like we see in the observations, and here you can't even really tell the orange line is very different from the other lines here. You can only get that if you are including the effects of increased carbon dioxide, increased methane, aerosols, and things like that. So this is an example of how we can attribute some observed change. So the observed change we see in this case is this increase in global average temperature, how we can attribute that to an anthropogenic, a human-caused process, so increase in carbon dioxide. So the most recent IPCC report, which is a report that's written by a panel of scientists all over the world and summarizes the state of the science, the estimate was that it's likely that humans contributed somewhere around 100% of this observed increase that we see since 1950, so over here. And maybe a little less, maybe a little more. There's some uncertainty there. Now, how certain you want to be about the statement is going to depend on that's going to affect the conclusion that you can draw. So to be very confident so that it's extremely likely, greater than 95% chance, we can conclude that more than half of this increase that we see is due to anthropogenic increases in greenhouse gases and other forcings. So how certain you want to be depends, will give you sort of the conclusions that you can draw. So in this first case, we want to be right 2/3 of the time. And so we estimate that a larger fraction of that increase is human caused. But if you want to be really sure, you could use something like 1 in 20 times. Maybe we would just happen to get this increase in global surface temperature that is, just by chance, get half of it due to anthropogenic forcings. So the confidence that you want to have in your conclusions really matters here. So the broad definition of attribution is evaluating the relative contributions or different factors to a change or event with this formal assessment of confidence. So those were the formal confidence assessments I was just talking about. So in this case, we have different causes that might be changing the climate, increasing greenhouse gases due to human emissions. You could have volcanoes, things like that. And so we're trying to attribute the observed changes to these different possible reasons. Now, it's more difficult to say that a particular event was caused by anthropogenic climate change because we had forest fires before there were humans, we had hurricanes before there were humans. So they are going to happen some of the time. So what we want to look at instead is how likely is a particular event? How likely is it that we would have a fire of the magnitude that we saw this past year? This is going to depend on the particulars of the quantity you're interested in. So, for example, temperature-related events, so really cold events or really hot events, are easier to attribute to increased greenhouse gases because there's very basic physics that links the greenhouse gases to the greenhouse effect to a warmer temperature. And so those are easiest to attribute. things that involve rain rain or precipitation are a little bit more difficult to attribute because there are more factors that go into figuring out what exactly caused a drought or an extreme rainfall. Okay, other things like extreme snow and cyclones are less feasible. And then things like wildfires and thunderstorms are difficult. Now, the science of attribution has been improving as we get a better understanding of the mechanisms, as well as better methods that are being detected. So this is a field in flux, and we're constantly learning more. A great resource if you're interested in Oregon climate change is the 5th Oregon Climate Assessment, which came out in January. And I have a bunch of references on my last slide I'll leave up. Then in the 2014, this climate change impacts report done by the National Academies and other people had a chapter focused on some Northwest effects. And so you already saw a bunch of, or heard about a bunch of these changes in snowmelt. So on the left-hand side, you see 2014, and then on the right-hand side is 2015. And 2015 was a very extreme year. And you can note that a lot of the snowpack was gone in 2015 at the same time of the year as it was the previous year. And we expect to see more years like 2015 in the future. Wildfires, you're all familiar with these. This combined with other things like insect outbreaks and disease are changing our forests already and will be changing them in the future. Attorney General Rosenblum also mentioned changes on the coast, sea level rise, erosion, increasing ocean acidity. And agriculture, there are ways that agriculture could adapt to changing conditions to offset some of these impacts, but there are a lot of concerns about how much that adaptation would cost, and new technologies, and especially things like the availability of water. When you have changes in rainfall and snow, you end up with it's more difficult to farm the way you used to. Okay, so we have some different pathways here, and this figure shows 2 different pathways. The lower one, this RCP 4.5, is a pathway where humans have a decrease in emission over the next few decades. And then the red one is if we don't decrease emissions and sort of continue on the pathway. There's a spread here for all of these, and this intermediate area, which is orange, those are places where, based on the uncertainty that we know in these predictions, you're going to get, both of these scenarios could potentially end us up in that area. But the expected value can differ. So, for example, with this lower emission pathway, somewhere maybe about 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit is what we're thinking by the end of the century, versus 9 degrees Fahrenheit or something like that. And so whether we're on this lower emission pathway or the upper really makes a difference. So I'm going to wrap up there since we're running slow on time, and I'm happy to answer questions. I'm going to end with some references if you want to look into specifics about climate change in the Northwest or Oregon and some of the attribution. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Professor Schell. And then Dan, we'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
All right, well, hey, I appreciate everyone. I appreciate the invitation. It's awesome to be on a panel like this, especially with you, Melissa. You were my professor, but all the errors that I make are entirely my own. It's also great to be here with Generals Rosenblum and Ferguson. I have the real honor and pleasure, as Melissa noted, of actually representing the state of Oregon as a Special Assistant Attorney General in a case that I spent a lot of time on. and I think is a great case, and in some ways a model for these kinds of cases against Monsanto for PCB-related contamination. Look, I don't want to take up a lot of time. I'd rather answer questions later on. So let me just give a quick overview of a couple of things. The first thing I would say is that every time I think about this, I want someone like Dr. Shell to come on and say, actually, we got it wrong. Climate's fine. We're all right. Cool. So I'll go back to our regularly scheduled programming, but it turns out that that never is true. So, you know, when I think about these cases, when I think about, you know, why are these cases special and different? The law isn't that bizarre. It's pretty straightforward. I mean, there are lots of different causes of action, and all the states' laws are a little bit different. But just look at public nuisance, right? Public nuisance is the unreasonable interference with the right held by the people, commonly, right? The whole litany of harms that Dr. Shell just rolled right through is sort of the very definition of that. I mean, it's totally unreasonable interference. And so, you know, I think from that part, it's pretty darn straightforward. You know, what I think you end up hearing about and why this feels a little bit different or maybe kind of stretches some folks' imagination is that two things. One is that up until recently, it was sort of hard to tease apart causation. I'll talk about that in just a second. And the other part about it is the damages are so big that it's sort of, you know, we sort of think, well, gosh, the damages are so big, so we have to treat this differently, which I think is sort of an insane way of thinking about that, right? Hey, go ahead. I think as both of our attorneys general said, this is an existential issue. That should mean that you're on the hook even more, not less. So in terms of the sort of the why now, like why is it today that these cases start to make more and more sense? I think it's about that attribution science, and a little bit different than what the attribution that Dr. Shaw was talking about. It's the, hey, if we know that these greenhouse gases are driving climate change, hey, who are the greenhouse gas sources? And it turns out that, I think it was in 2013 when the first studies came out and suggested, hey, we know that, I think it was 65% of our sort of historical climate changing emissions are really attributable to about 90, it's under 100 entities. Hey, you know what? That's fine. The law knows how to deal with this kind of an issue. And I think that as I said, I litigate PCBs, but my firm is also intimately involved in this opioid litigation. You know, there we have lots of actors, lots of terrible actors. You know, you've got Purdue and Mallinckrodt and all these other entities. They all share responsibility for creating really and driving this opioid nuisance, public nuisance, really. So I think that you have the science, and again, I think, you know, every state's law is a little bit different, but the idea here is this is in some ways a pretty, you know, sort of uninteresting application of public nuisance law. Yes, there's some interesting issues with the science, et cetera, but I think when you get right down to it, it's not that, this isn't the fringe case that the defendants will say. One of my favorite things is defendants love to say, you know, hey, without PCBs, without oil, we would have lost World War II. As one of the experts that I work with in my case said, the Nazis had both, so they lost World War II. So not really a great argument. Let me just say really quickly two last little things that, you know, Professor Powers noted. This isn't the first wave of climate litigation, and I'm really excited about this version of it. Right? I think that a lot of us thought, hey, let's get governments to take action to sort of curb what's going on. Turns out, I think states may not have, you know, this sort of, how do we deal with this on a national or global scale in terms of reducing climate emitting gases? That might be the more effective level for those pieces of litigation. But this case really is about saying, hey, the state, counties, and I know that Commissioner Caferry is going to talk about this, you know, we're feeling the harms here at these levels, and we need to be able to make sure that those who are responsible for making those harms, for causing those harms, are on the hook to help offset those costs. And so I think with that, I'll stop talking now, turn it over to Commissioner Caferry, and obviously I'm happy to answer some questions later on. Melissa, did I do it in enough time?
Yes.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this event today. And I want to give my thanks to the organizers at the Center for Climate Integrity for inviting me to join this impressive group. I am neither a lawyer nor a professor, just a lowly public servant. I want to start out today by acknowledging just how difficult of a year it has been for all of us, really, as we mark the 1-year anniversary of COVID-19 in our communities. The last 12 months have been filled with many kinds of trauma. The upending of routines and balance and a sense of grounding, the grief of losing family, friends, colleagues, and neighbors, and the loss of jobs and income and stability. Starting on day 1 of this pandemic, Multnomah County leaned into our unique role as the public health authority and as the state's largest social safety net service provider to make sure that individuals and families had the support they needed to endure this once in a lifetime crisis. And in short, the pandemic threw a spotlight on the many crises that existed in our community before March 2020. The homelessness and housing affordability, food instability and domestic violence, underemployment, over-incarceration, and disparities in access to quality health care and support for working families. The pandemic also exposed the pervasive role of systemic racism, which caused all of these inequities to be experienced more deeply and more acutely by communities of color. So we anticipated that everyone in our community would be impacted by the pandemic, but we knew that not everyone would experience it the same way. And that's what we heard from people within these communities, and that's what we saw in the data. So Multnomah County built our COVID-19 response with a commitment to equity, making sure that our strategies are geared towards those who face both the highest risks of harm and the highest barriers to resources. And I bring this up not just because of the timing, but because of the parallels that we can draw between the pandemic and climate change. And as we all hopefully know by now, communities of color bear the brunt of harms related to climate change too. Just this week, I saw an article about how both Portland and Seattle are among the major cities where historically red line neighborhoods don't just suffer a far higher risk of climate change related flooding today, they're also home to a greater share of non-white households. From flooding to air pollution from cars and trucks to urban heat islands, the history of redlining and racism are still present in our community and are still causing harm to our Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. So I recognize that today's discussion is focused on advancing accountability for the harms of climate change. I also want to make sure that our discussion never loses sight of the fact that while the fossil fuel industry harms everyone, not everyone experiences those harms the same way. And understanding that will be critical to crafting our strategies to address and undo the incredible damage that fossil fuels have inflicted on our communities. And with that said, I also want to draw attention to the fact that similar to COVID-19, climate change compounds, exacerbates, and complicates existing threats to people's health and well-being. We saw that this fall in Oregon. We've all been talking about the unprecedented wildfires and wildfire smoke that choked our air. And incidentally, the pandemic we are dealing with is a respiratory illness that thrives on human contact. We were able here locally to manage, we opened up the Oregon Convention Center as a severe weather shelter to provide physical distancing and clean air space, but it was a gigantic lift and it warns of larger challenges to come. The same goes for the crises of housing and homelessness. Our neighbors who are surviving outside are among the most vulnerable to the new normal of weather extremes. And our efforts to ensure that everyone has a safe place to call home isn't just a moral imperative, it's also one of public health. And it only becomes more urgent by the day as climate change makes the elements that people experiencing homelessness are exposed to day in and day out less predictable and more extreme. And although a safe and stable home is vital to your health and well-being, sometimes even a stable home isn't enough to guarantee safety when smoke can creep through leaky windows or mold blossoms in the winter months as torrential rains seep into deteriorating roofs. These are conditions that our weatherization team sees every day, but the financial crisis coupled with the climate crisis threaten to overwhelm our already strained resources. But it is not all doom and gloom. What we have learned with COVID-19 is that when we work together on a common purpose, we can move the needle. In Multnomah County, we've lowered our current community-wide carbon emissions to 18% below 1990 levels. I will acknowledge that they're not falling fast enough and we need to do more. But unlike most of the country, we have achieved substantial declines. And we've also seen huge declines in Multnomah County's operational carbon emissions, with a 64% decrease from our 2007 baseline emissions. This has been mostly driven by a switch to the purchase of green electricity and investments in energy efficiency. This rapid drop in the county's operational emissions illuminates, for me, the ability that we have as a community to achieve meaningful reductions by working with our utilities to clean up the electrical supply. But we should make no mistake about the cause of the climate crisis. For far too long, we have been led to believe that what mattered most in this fight to turn the tide on climate change was personal behavior. But we know now that systems level change is what it will take to rescue our health and our planet. I am a proud lifelong Portlander. I used cloth diapers for my kids and I can recycle with the best of them, but my personal behavior will not solve the climate crisis. Finding meaningful and effective solutions to any crisis requires identifying and addressing its root cause. And when it comes to the climate crisis, the driving cause has been the profit motive of powerful corporations. And that's where we find our best opportunity to both slow down their harmful activities and repair the harms they've already caused. As we just heard, there is a parallel here to the opioid crisis, which was driven in large part by the pursuit of profits, no matter how many lives were derailed or lost to addiction. And that's why my colleagues on the board of Multnomah County Commissioners and I declared those companies a nuisance and filed a lawsuit to recoup the financial damages that their product has caused our community. I am under no illusions that Multnomah County's lawsuit will solve on its own the opioid crisis, but holding the corporations that have knowingly caused, profited from, and sustained a destructive crisis accountable is a necessary step to draw a line in the sand and set up a pathway to support the recovery and repair of our communities. And as with COVID-19, the climate crisis is an all hands on deck moment. That means that we all need to do our own part, but we also need every tool at our disposal and every branch of government doing their part to address the root causes of the crisis. So as we look to accelerate the rate at which we reduce our emissions, and as we look for ways to draw the carbon heating our climate out of the atmosphere, as we look to cope with an already changed climate that is wreaking havoc today, we must take the fight directly to the corporations that have knowingly sold us a dangerous product and demand accountability that can help us begin building a climate just future today. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chair Caferry. I thought I could ask actually a question of you to begin, which is back to the issue of resources. And within the county, you know, the scope of the problem that you've identified from a climate perspective is pretty massive. And, you know, the reference to, for example, during the wildfires and opening up, you know, specific emergency sites actually illustrates to me the expanse of the climate crisis, because, you know, emergency measures are only one part. And, you know, by definition, they're sort of reactive and trying to address something that has occurred in a way that maybe couldn't be anticipated, or at the scale that couldn't be anticipated. How much for the county is resource constraint a big factor in terms of what it can do in terms of climate change versus not? And, you know, if you had unlimited resources, how would you envision, there's no such thing, I know, but how would you envision being able to actually move when it comes to climate adaptation in particular?
Wow, getting to dream. I don't, I've been so focused on crisis after crisis. It's nice to be able to think about that. You know, we have been working really hard to make changes in cooperation, say, with the utilities around having clean electric energy. So I think that's so much been where our focus is. But I know that we both have to prepare for a future where we're going to have more wildfires and more, you know, air pollution. So we've been focusing on adapting our buildings with, you know, high efficiency HVAC, those kind of things to allow for places that people can escape. We're helping communities, especially low-income communities who rely on wood stoves to heat their homes, to help them change away from that. I think that, you know, we don't talk a lot about wood smoke as an air pollutant, and it's definitely additive to our troubles. And we know that here in our region, a lot of people do rely on wood smoke, and a lot of people burn it for pleasure as well. So I think that one thing I would do if I had a large pot of money right now is to change out people's old wood smoke, wood fireplaces and wood stoves, and doing larger campaign to educate people as to what the dangers are.
Yeah, excellent. And I mean, it seems to me that even that example just shows how, you know, we have so much infrastructure locked in, and so adaptation responses are going to be challenging because it's so incremental, and you would go into each home and leading to the question of where does one get those resources? And so turning to Dan, could you talk a little bit, first of all, when we talk about getting resources, one of the things that I think we sometimes see from the courts is a fear, not so much of what happens if in this one case, this particular defendant is held liable, but if all defendants are held liable for all of the harms, just the scale of liability becomes so huge that I think courts sometimes are reticent to find that first party accountable. And we can see it even in the opioid discussion that we've been having, but could you talk a little bit about how, as a litigator, you navigate that dynamic of, you know, just like presenting to the court what you did present to us, which is that, you know, this is basic liability 101.
Right. Well, Melissa, you have put your finger right on one of the most challenging things, right? That here you've got, you know, the damages are so overwhelming that it's easy to get lost in that, right? And so I think that when I come to these kinds of issues, there are two, I think, important themes, two important messages to remember. And the first one is the liability, right? Turns out all these corporations act in a very similar way, right? It's sort of the tobacco-like story. You know, folks knew from the beginning that say the you know, tobacco, maybe not from the very beginning, but you know, the tobacco is a problem. Opioids as well. I mean, good Lord, we have these incredible documents where the corporations are saying, hey, let's addict people because we can get more, you know, make more money. Turns out the same thing is true in the climate context, right? That Exxon and others were out there at the front learning about what the issues are, knowing that there's a problem, and then deliberately going to obfuscate. So I actually don't think that that's a required element of the legal case. I actually think that if you created a public nuisance, whether you knew that you were going to or not, it's actually not one of the legal claims. But I think it's an important framing of the story, right? You knew exactly what you were doing. You had a chance to make a different decision than you did. And so just like when my kids know that they had a better option rather than messing everything up, they chose to mess up their rooms. Now they got to clean it up. And so I think that's the second prong of this, is that when we talk about damages, we talk about what is it going to take to sort of adapt to these new climate realities, it's telling the compelling stories that Chair Caferry was just articulating, right? These aren't just sort of, I love a polar bear. I have never seen a polar bear in person, right? And it pains me that we are effectively have made them extinct, right? It stinks, is a existential whatever metaphor, but actually, if you stop and think, I have suffered all sorts of climate related problems, right? I can tick them off in terms of my tax dollars. I live in Seattle at present. Climate change as it raises the sea level in Puget Sound. The city of Seattle and King County are going to have to retool their entire stormwater system to raise it up. That is going to be so expensive, and it's not like somebody else is going to come in and pay for it unless we can get these, the carbon majors, et cetera, pay for it. It's otherwise coming out of my tax dollars. I'm not interested in that, right? Once upon a time, I grew up here in Seattle. We went out and fished for salmon with my grandparents. They're really, I can't go do that like I once did with my kids. So when we start sort of saying like, hey, we have these real impacts, right? It's on you and it's me and it's on our neighbors who are experiencing homelessness today. And Chair Caferry, I think that your comment about this really affects our communities of color, our low income. It's just yet one more burden that we're layering on top of them, and being able to articulate what are those harms and what are the things that we could do if we had the right tools, right? It's thinking about being creative about new coastal adaptations. It's thinking about what are the things that we have to stop doing to replace the harms we're having. And I think being able to tell those compelling stories. And that tees into one thing. You didn't ask me about this, but let me just say, one of the reasons why I think that these cases, especially the state cases, make sense to stay in state court. And I know a little bit of that is that these are local stories. These are stories about things that are happening here, right? It's in Portland, it's in Multnomah County, it's in Coos Bay, it's in Seattle, wherever it is, right? We know these situations, we know the resources, we know the people who are being affected by this in a way that, great. Federal courts have lots of resources, but this is a story about these local impacts. So I think that's a long-winded answer to your relatively short question.
So let's actually tee up on that, just since we're law school, so we're going to do a little law here. And so, the first wave of climate litigation was in the federal courts, and the Supreme Court issued a decision that held that the Clean Air Act basically trumps climate cases, at least when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions and common law claims trying to compel reductions, whether we're compelling governments to reduce or private parties to reduce. So this new wave of climate litigation has been filed in the state courts. And part of what you're saying is that state courts include state judges who actually understand what's happening at the local level. But we see the fossil fuel defendants trying to get the cases into federal court. And in fact, there's a case right now pending before the Supreme Court. Could you talk a little bit about what's going on in that case and what you think is going on in terms of the fossil fuel company strategy?
Yeah, I mean, yes, of course. I think let me say the case really quickly in front of the Supreme Court is on a really narrow issue, sort of I think it's a Baltimore case. The defendants there removed the case from state court to federal court. The federal court said we don't have jurisdiction and remanded it back. And now the question is whether or not a court of appeals can actually review that decision. So it's a pretty narrow question. The removal statute is based on federal officer jurisdiction, and the defendant's argument is we were doing all this, we were drilling and et cetera, oil as if we were an officer of the federal government. And if that were in fact the case, and you were doing this as if you were a federal employee, then you have this immunity, et cetera. So it's a pretty narrow question. In fact, all it's asking is whether or not an appellate court can review the decision as to whether or not the remand was proper. I think 9 courts have said, yes, the court can review this. So my guess is that the justices will say, yes, we can review it. I think that the claim that it is under federal officer jurisdiction is weak. I think it's not a compelling argument at all. You have to have something more than the federal government would say buying this or encouraging, et cetera. It's got to really be the direction of it. And one of the sort of key cases there is the Agent Orange case. So I think it was Dow Chemicals, the defendant, and said, look, the federal government came to us and said, here's the recipe we want you to make, right? This is how we want you to make Agent Orange. This is what we want you to put into it, et cetera. So essentially, the federal government was just using Dow's machinery to make a thing that they wanted. And so then the court said, okay, well, look, Dow is actually just acting as if it was the federal government. Here, it's not like the federal government is coming out and saying, here's how we want your oil to be drilled, et cetera. It might be just a license to produce, but that I think doesn't get us there or get the defendants into federal court. Why do they want to be in federal court? I guess if I had caused the end of the world and I was looking for a get out of jail free card, I guess I would look at the federal Supreme Court and think that's probably my best bet. So I don't know, they probably can articulate more why they want it, but if I were that and I was saying, what the hell, let's just see what our most favorable jurisdiction is, I think that's where it is. Maybe I'm being cynical, but that's my guess.
Well, I would say no, because you also have the standing doctrine and you have the political question doctrine and you have a bunch of other legal barriers that have impeded access to the court so far at the federal level. There was actually another question that somebody asked about this issue of state court versus federal court, but I want to take the issue of, you think that it's a relatively weak argument for them to try to move these cases into federal court. And before we talk about the legality, let's talk about the practicality. A fair number of people just think that this is a resource, this is a set of defendants with a great deal of resources, right? They're very wealthy companies. And so the more that they can take a lawsuit and try to move it into federal court and then waste time, the more money, the more attorney time, the more resources are being expended by the attorneys as well as by, for example, the governments that are being represented in this case. From an attorney perspective, how much of that delay do you think is significant? And then, Chair Caferry, I don't want to pressure you to answer a question that you feel like maybe you shouldn't talk about, but at least in the case of the opioid crisis, I anticipate it just must be extremely resource intensive to be able to bring these types of actions. And I wonder without talking about specifics, maybe if you could talk a little bit about the practicalities of balancing how you make a decision to make such a tricky investment in terms of pursuing those types of actions.
Yeah, we know that we have limited resources. That is, by definition, local government. But we also know, as Dan was talking about, the huge amount of cost that, whether you're talking about climate or you're talking about the opioid crisis, is borne on local government. And so you weigh your chances of, obviously, of success, but you also, I think, and I'm not a lawyer again, but I do think the more pressure and the more we build up these cases, will help us in the long run. I mean, I think a few years ago, if someone had said you should do these lawsuits, we would have said, oh, no. But now it's like, well, yes. What other options do we have? We can continue to be complacent and say, okay, well, we're just going to let these rich pharmaceutical companies get away with depositing, people literally on the streets of downtown Portland who are addicted, or we can fight back and do something about it. And while we don't, I don't know that we're gonna win these. I do think we have to continue to do it. We have to do it. And I know that if we keep on doing it, at some point we are gonna win. So maybe I'm just a optimist, but I think that's where we are.
You have a litigator soul then, I think, even if you're not a lawyer. Dan, did you want to just really briefly talk about this from the legal perspective, just maybe for like a minute, because I have one last question I'd like to throw over to Professor Schall if we have time.
Sure. So I think the question was just sort of delay and fighting gigantic corporations that have unlimited resources. So first, yeah, of course, again, this goes back to when you have done a terrible thing, you delay as long as you can, right? If a defendant is thinking, I'm going to have to pay $1 billion, it's going to have to be a lot more than that, the longer you hold that $1 billion, it turns out that the interest on $1 billion is a lot. And until you pay that, you're making the interest on that. So delay is in their favor often. In terms of resources from government entities, yeah, this will be a significant undertaking, but there are lots of tools that I think plaintiffs can share. Sometimes states and counties, et cetera, have the resources to bring these cases in-house. And sometimes, as the Attorney General Rosenblum did in the Oregon versus Monsanto case, has hired outside counsel, my firm. And so, like I said at the beginning, this is a case that means a ton to me, and it's just such an honor to be able to represent Oregon in a case like this. And so I think that there are various tools that states and other government entities can bring in order to successfully litigate a case like this, or the OBO case, et cetera. So I think that there are lots of tools out there to balance the fight.
So we have about a second, not very much time left. But I wanted really quickly to come back to the science issue for half a second and just ask whether, in the context of climate science, do you feel, Karen, that at least that there's more evidence accruing every day that would support, I mean, I know you're not a lawyer, but that, helps bolster these cases?
Absolutely. We're continually learning more things, especially related to local and regional effects. That's an area that's seen a lot of improvement of understanding and being able to make better predictions. And so I think, yeah, the next few years, you're going to see more and more seasonal predictions about changes in stream flow and things like that can be used to make decisions about dams and whether to release water and things like that, and more precise, predictions that are really focused at the local level, because carbon dioxide is a gas. It's global. It's affecting the whole planet, but people feel the local effects. And so the slides I went through real quickly those are the things that the Pacific Northwest is feeling and will continue to feel. Everywhere you go is different. And I think we're learning more and more about those differences and the magnitudes of changes, how large or how big of a difference do we expect to see?
Great, thank you. And then AG Rosenblum, we saw you back. I know you've been here the whole time, but it's nice to see you. Did you have any final things that you wanted to add before we wrap up for the day?
Well, mostly I came back because I wanted you to know I'd been listening really carefully. I just didn't want to, distract anybody with my presence, but I wanted to thank you all for this really important discussion. And what I was just thinking is it seems like it's just the beginning, that there's so much more that we need to talk about. But I loved the combination of speakers, and I wanted to thank you, Professor, for having me, and Bob. I know he might have had to sign off, but it really means a lot to know that you think that we, as the chief law officers of the state, can actually contribute to this discussion. And I think we can actually get something done. And having people like Dan Menscher on a big case like Monsanto, I think that's going to tell us a lot, frankly, how this case goes in terms of where we head next. So I appreciate it. It gives me renewed energy to proceed with this existential crisis of our time. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I wanted to thank all of our panelists for taking the time to come and talk to us today, and also for taking on this is such a big issue, and it can be scary and it can be really complex, and there's so many moving pieces all the time. I think it takes a lot of bravery to really think about how we use legal tools, how we advance the science, how we advance policy to basically ensure that we maintain a livable community. So thank you all very much for providing us with your thoughts and insights. Just so you know, there will be a recording available of this on the Green Energy Institute's website. So if there was anything you wanted to listen to again, And then I agree with AG Rosenblum. I think this is just the beginning of the conversation, or actually probably a little bit into the conversation at this point, but there's a lot more talking to be had and a lot more thinking to be done. So we welcome hearing from anybody out there in the ether. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions, but thanks for joining us. And thanks again to Dan Menscher and Professor Schell and Chair Caferry and AG Rosenblum and AG Ferguson, as well as the conference organizers, sponsors. Thanks very much. Have a great rest of your day.